On the night of April 16, 2004, an armed unit moved silently through the bushes surrounding the store known as Rancho Alhombro, located in a remote rural area of Córdoba. Inside, Carlos Castaño Gil, the most feared man in Colombia, was reviewing documents on a computer, unaware of what was about to happen. When the first bursts of gunfire shattered the silence, Carlos jumped through a back window. But a bullet had already struck him. Wounded and with a fractured arm, he tried to escape while shouting to those chasing him. "Brother, please don't take my life. Little brother, I already sent word and I can explain everything. It's a misunderstanding." His pleas were useless. The man who had ordered his elimination was not there, but he was directing the operation from a distance. It was his own brother, Vicente Castaño. What few people knew was that this was not the first time blood had been spilled within the Castaño family. Years earlier, Fidel, the eldest brother, had died under equally suspicious circumstances. The official version spoke of a clash with guerrilla fighters, but rumors pointed to Carlos as the mastermind behind his death. Three brothers who founded the most powerful illegal armed group in Colombia ultimately ended up eliminating one another. What dark secrets pushed this family to become its own executioner? How did they go from avenging their father to betraying each other? The story of the Castaño brothers is not just a chronicle of violence in Colombia. It is the story of how power, ambition, and family secrets can destroy even the strongest bonds of blood. Where did you bury the boy? With this devastating question, Rosa Eva Gil Herrera, the matriarch of the Castaño family, confronted her son Vicente at his estate known as La 16 in San Pedro de Urabá. Witnesses present that day say Vicente, the man who commanded an army of thousands, could not hold his mother's gaze. He slipped out through a side door, unable to explain why he had ordered the death of his younger brother. Consumed by grief, Doña Rosa left him with a final message. "When the day comes that you take my life, don't do it with a bullet or from behind. Do it with a knife, but put it through the womb, because that's where I brought you into this world." This scene, which took place weeks after the death of Carlos Castaño, reveals only the surface of a family story filled with contradictions that are difficult to explain. The most disturbing question of all remains: how did the brothers who swore to avenge their father's death at the hands of guerrilla fighters end up eliminating each other? What secrets did they hold that were more powerful than blood itself? The Castaños were not ordinary criminals. They had built a paramilitary empire that eventually controlled vast regions of Colombia, influencing politics, the economy, and even decisions made by the state. Yet beneath this facade of power lay a web of betrayals and family secrets that not even their closest collaborators fully understood. The official story claims that everything began with the kidnapping and death of Jesus Antonio Castaño González, the father of the brothers, at the hands of the FARC in 1981. This traumatic event supposedly pushed Fidel, the eldest, to create an armed group to avenge his father and fight against the guerrillas. Carlos and Vicente would later join this family crusade. However, later investigations cast doubt on this narrative. Judicial documents reveal that Fidel was already a millionaire before his father's kidnapping, owning luxurious properties in Amalfi, Antioquia. Where did that fortune come from? Some witnesses say Fidel had already displayed violent behavior long before the kidnapping. One day we saw him arguing with his father in the town square of Amalfi. He pulled out a revolver and we all thought he was going to take his father's life. They were already violent men long before their father was kidnapped, one witness later recalled. Even more puzzling is a revelation made by Jesus Ignacio Roldan, known as Mono Leche, one of the men closest to the Castaños. According to him, Fidel, the founder of Colombian paramilitarism, had left-leaning views and, in a twist that seems almost impossible to understand, had even attempted to join the FARC. the same group that supposedly took his father's life. Fidel was a man with leftist ideas, but he ended up fighting the guerrillas because of the kidnapping and killing of his father, Monolech said from prison. This contradiction raises troubling questions. Was the revenge for their father simply a convenient narrative? What truly motivated the Castaño brothers to create one of the most feared armed organizations in Colombia? And more importantly, what caused the brothers to go from inseparable allies to enemies willing to eliminate one another? The answer might lie in a USB drive seized after Carlos's death. Inside were thousands of emails revealing his growing frustration with the infiltration of illegal substance trafficking within the paramilitary movement, and his plans to surrender to authorities in the United States. I have decided to surrender to the justice system of the United States, and I have already made contact with agents from that country, Carlos admitted during a meeting that left other members of the organization stunned. Was that decision his death sentence? What secrets was Carlos threatening to reveal that were so dangerous his own brother ordered his elimination? The story of the Castaño brothers is full of conflicting versions, partial testimonies, and incomplete documents. Some see them as defenders who emerged in regions abandoned by the state. Others see them as criminals who used political rhetoric to hide illegal operations. The only certainty is that at the heart of this family, a tragedy of almost Shakespearean proportions was unfolding, one in which power, ambition, and hidden truths ultimately proved stronger than blood ties. And like every classical tragedy, the ending would be just as brutal as the path that led there. To understand the magnitude of the Castaño tragedy, we must go back to the origins of the family that would forever change the course of Colombia's conflict. Rosa Eva Gil Herrera gave birth to 12 children, though some accounts speak of as many as 16 pregnancies. Those who knew her say she was rarely seen smiling. A rancher in the region known as El Apostol once recalled that the few smiles Doña Rosa showed were less like laughter and more like sarcastic expressions, sometimes blank, mysterious, like the smile of the Mona Lisa. The patriarch, Jesus Antonio Castaño González, was a cattle rancher from Amalfi, Antioquia, a region that during the 1970s and 1980s saw the expansion of guerrilla groups, particularly the FARC and the ELN. Rich in natural resources and with little state presence, the area became the stage for territorial disputes between different armed actors. Fidel, the eldest brother, showed a dominant and ambitious personality from a young age. After finishing primary school, he left home and did not return for more than 5 years. According to his brother Manuel Castaño, before leaving Amalfi, Fidel said with determination, "I'm leaving this place, and when I come back, I'll buy the richest man in town with the loose change in my pocket." During that time, he lived in Venezuela and worked in a diamond mine in Guyana. When he returned, Fidel began acquiring properties and expanding his economic activities towards Segovia, where he became involved in gambling operations, contraband merchandise, timber theft, and the hijacking of cargo trucks on commercial routes. His rise in wealth was both rapid and suspicious. By the early 1980s, he was already traveling with heavily armed bodyguards and openly displaying his wealth without restraint. Carlos, on the other hand, was considered the most intelligent and charismatic of the brothers. Unlike Fidel, he received formal education, although he never completed higher studies. From an early age, he showed strong skills in public speaking and leadership, qualities that would later make him the public face of the paramilitary movement. Vicente, the youngest of the three, was more reserved and methodical. He preferred to remain in the shadows while his brothers captured public attention. The turning point in the family's story came in 1981 when Jesus Castaño was kidnapped by the FARC. According to the most widely known version, the guerrilla group demanded 36 million pesos for his release, an enormous sum at the time. My father's ranch with all his cattle was worth 100,000 pesos. That's what it actually sold for, Carlos later said. Despite their efforts, the family managed to gather only 14 million pesos. The patriarch's life was taken. This traumatic event became the founding story of the paramilitary groups. Carlos Castaño repeated the story in many interviews, presenting it as the origin of his armed struggle. However, later investigations challenged that narrative. Journalist Maria Teresa Ronderos, author of the book Recycled Wars, argues that the story of an armed group born solely from the kidnapping and death of the father is a propaganda construction designed to retroactively justify a criminal enterprise. According to Ronderos, financial and notarial records show that Fidel Castaño was already a millionaire by the time of the kidnapping, buying luxurious ranches in Amalfi. The story of the murdered father may have served to give moral legitimacy to a structure that was already forming beforehand. What is certain is that after their father's death, the Castaño brothers consolidated what would become the embryo of the future United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia. They began with a rudimentary armed structure known as Los Tangueros, named after the ranch Las Tangas, a family property located in southern Córdoba. This group had not only firepower but also early intelligence networks, logistical support, and backing from ranchers and business sectors in the region seeking protection from guerrilla presence. The logic was simple: eliminate any support base for the guerrillas and control the territory. At the national level, Colombia was going through a turbulent period. The trafficking of illegal substances was emerging as a devastating economic and political force. The Medellin and Cali cartels were battling for control of the business, and the state proved unable to maintain its monopoly of force in large areas of the country. This power vacuum was quickly exploited by multiple armed actors. The paths of the Castaño brothers and Pablo Escobar soon crossed. Fidel, with resources, contacts, and growing regional influence, became useful to the Medellin cartel. Their first connections formed through the illegal trade of substances, routes, protection, and money laundering. But the relationship went beyond business when Fidel entered the inner circle of the organization. Another meeting point came with the creation of MAS, Death to Kidnappers, a clandestine armed group created by traffickers of illegal substances to confront guerrilla groups that were kidnapping their partners and attacking their properties. The alignment of interests made the emerging paramilitary movement and the trafficking networks natural allies. It was in this environment that the young Carlos Castaño first witnessed up close the machinery of the illegal substance trade and the use of terror as a tool of power. This early exposure shaped his character and defined the role he would later play as the ideologue and military leader of the paramilitary movement. By the late 1980s, the Castaño brothers had consolidated their presence in northwestern Colombia. Their armed structure was no longer just a local self-defense group. It had become an organization with regional operational capacity. Fidel, as the natural leader, directed military operations, while Carlos began emerging as the political strategist of the group. Vicente managed finances and logistics, always remaining in a discreet second-line role. The professionalization of these paramilitary groups marked a turning point in their evolution. One of the most documented cases is that of former Israeli Lieutenant Colonel Yair Klein, who arrived in Colombia hired by ranchers, traffickers of illegal substances, and businessmen interested in stopping the advance of guerrilla groups. Klein and his team trained members of paramilitary groups in selective elimination tactics, explosives, ambush techniques, and intense military discipline. Rodriguez Gacha was the first to start the war against the members of the Patriotic Union. He brought an Israeli mercenary to teach elimination techniques in urban areas, a former paramilitary member later said. These trainings took place mainly in camps located in the Magdalena Medio region, a strategic area where the interests of the paramilitary groups, the Medellin cartel, and elements of the army converged. This professionalization soon translated into concrete actions. By the late 1980s, some of the most brutal massacres carried out by these groups began to occur. One of the most remembered is the Segovia massacre on November 11, 1988, when a paramilitary unit entered the municipality and took the lives of 43 people. The attack was meant to punish the electoral support that the region had given to the Patriotic Union. That same year, on March 4th, the Major Esquina massacre took place in Córdoba. An armed group under Fidel Castaños' command entered the village and took the lives of more than 20 people in a coordinated action, supposedly targeting guerrilla sympathizers. These operations cemented the reputation of the Castaño brothers as relentless paramilitary leaders. In 1991, Colombia's political landscape experienced major changes. The Popular Liberation Army, EPL, one of the insurgent groups active since the 1970s, signed a peace agreement with the state. More than 2,000 fighters laid down their weapons and joined civilian life. At the same time, in Medellin, Pablo Escobar was waging an open war against the state. In what appeared to be a gesture of peace, Fidel Castaño demobilized 300 men along with their weapons and created the organization FUNPAZCOR, the Foundation for Peace in Córdoba, whose stated goal was to return lands that had been taken during the conflict. However, later investigations revealed that FUNPAZCOR largely served as a front to legalize properties that had been seized by force. Some of the ranches were divided into plots between 5 and 20 hectares, explained an investigator from Colombia's Truth Commission. But the land was never truly donated to the peasants as they were told. They were warned they could not sell without permission from the foundation. Later, they were pressured to sell at extremely low prices or abandon the land altogether. Some received symbolic payments, others nothing. In the end, everyone fled out of fear. The relationship between the Castaños and Pablo Escobar would take a dramatic turn in 1992. On June 19, 1991, Escobar had surrendered voluntarily after the approval of a constitutional article banning the extradition of Colombian citizens. He was held in the so-called prison of La Catedral, a facility essentially designed to his specifications and under his control. In July 1992, inside La Catedral, Escobar ordered the deaths of 2 of his closest allies, Fernando El Negro Galeano and Gerardo Kiko Moncada. These killings triggered an internal fracture within the organization and alarmed Escobar's partners. Fidel and Carlos Castaño, who until then had operated as territorial allies of the cartel, interpreted the murders as a signal that no one was safe. Escobar had even summoned them to the prison shortly before the killings, something they interpreted as a possible trap. From that moment on, the brothers decided to break with Escobar and launch an open offensive against him. Thus was born the group known as Los Pepes, people persecuted by Pablo Escobar, an alliance of traffickers of illegal substances, paramilitaries, and former cartel associates seeking revenge for betrayals and the destruction of Escobar's power. If Escobar ordered someone eliminated, that person had almost no chance of surviving, explained a former intelligence agent. They knew the only way to survive was to organize themselves and strike back. That group became known as Los Pepes. Within this coalition emerged a key figure, Diego Fernando Murillo Bejarano, known as Don Berna, a former EPL combatant and close associate of the Moncada family, who would later become one of the most influential leaders within the paramilitary movement. The campaign against Escobar was systematic. Properties were destroyed, collaborators were taken out, intelligence was leaked to the search block, and psychological pressure was applied to Escobar's inner circle. Finally, on December 2, 1993, Pablo Escobar was eliminated on a rooftop in the Los Olivos neighborhood of Medellin. His death closed one violent chapter but did not end the trafficking of illegal substances or the cycle of violence. For the Castaño brothers, it was a tactical victory that confirmed their growing power and allowed them to move toward a new objective: consolidating territorial control and expanding the paramilitary model across the country. However, just 1 month after Escobar's death, an unexpected event shook the foundations of the Castaño family. Fidel disappeared. His death, which occurred under circumstances that remain unclear to this day, continues to generate multiple theories and conflicting accounts. The official version claims Fidel died in a confrontation with members of the Popular Liberation Army in a rural area between San Pedro de Urabá and Santa Catalina. Carlos repeated this version publicly for years, but testimony from Jesus Ignacio Roldan, Monoleche, raised serious doubts. According to him, Fidel had gone ahead of his group after receiving information about guerrilla presence in the area. What happened next puzzled everyone. "We saw a person on that hill," he said. "Just one person. There were no guerrillas, nothing. Just a single person who fired and disappeared." Another controversial theory suggests the death may have been connected to a personal conflict between Fidel and Carlos. According to this version, Carlos had a relationship with one of Fidel's romantic partners, a woman identified as Olga Escobar. When Fidel discovered the relationship, he allegedly ordered her elimination, causing a deep fracture between the brothers. Furious over her death, Carlos may have decided to take revenge by ordering Fidel's elimination. A third version suggests Fidel himself had taken the life of their sister Romualda after discovering her in bed with one of his partners. Carlos, who was very close to Romualda, would have reacted with rage. Perhaps the most surprising revelation again came from Monolech. He claimed Fidel, despite his reputation as a fierce enemy of insurgent groups, had actually planned to join the FARC. Fidel was a man with leftist ideas, Monolech said, but he fought the guerrillas because of what happened to his father. According to him, Fidel had even purchased a large shipment of weapons that he later sent to the guerrilla group as part of that plan. Monolech feared that if Fidel consolidated those plans, a direct confrontation between the brothers would become inevitable. Fidel would have an entire FARC front at his disposal. Carlos would lead a growing paramilitary force. What is clearly documented is that after Fidel's death, Carlos took full control of the organization. With Vicente's help, he hid Fidel's death for several months until they had secured the loyalty of the armed groups under the Castaño family command. Only then did they announce Fidel's death and reorganize the movement. Carlos Castaño, Mauricio Garcia, known as Doble Cero, and Vicente Castaño formed a new command structure. Carlos and Doble Cero assumed political and military leadership. Vicente handled logistics and finances. The new organization was given a name, the Peasant Self-Defense Forces of Córdoba and Urabá, known as the ACCU. Over the following years, the war between paramilitary groups and guerrillas intensified. Rodrigo Doble Cero, a retired army officer and close ally of Carlos, trained combat units. Another figure also emerged, Salvatore Mancuso, an Italian-Colombian rancher who rose rapidly through the ranks until becoming one of the most powerful commanders. The expansion of paramilitary forces also relied on covert collaboration from sectors of the state. Security groups legally established as Convivir, community surveillance cooperatives created in 1994, became strategic platforms of cooperation. Paramilitary members infiltrated these organizations to gain access to weapons, ammunition, and operational legitimacy. "I was an army non-commissioned officer," one former soldier later confessed. "They would tell us, 'You're going to patrol with some cousins.' Back then, we called the AUC members cousins. We would go out with 100 soldiers and they would go with 50 or 60 paramilitaries to retake areas." Paramilitaries would enter the 17th Brigade armed and in uniform, and nobody said anything. This dynamic allowed the ACCU to consolidate and expand, preparing the leap toward a nationwide organization. On April 18, 1997, during a secret meeting in San Pedro de Urabá, more than a dozen illegal armed structures agreed to unite under a single name: the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, the AUC. Carlos Castaños was proclaimed commander-in-chief and political spokesman of the new paramilitary federation. The night of December 31, 2001 marked the beginning of the end for Carlos Castaños. While Colombia celebrated the arrival of the new year, the commander of the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia was gathering documents related to his legal assets in order to write his will, with a premonition that would later prove prophetic. Carlos wrote his final wishes on one of the two computers inside the Rancho Alhambra store, the very place where he would eventually lose his life. "It is my wish to leave in your hands and conscience my will regarding the destiny of my humble family estate," Carlos wrote, carefully detailing how his properties should be distributed among his children, his wife, and his closest collaborators. He ended the letter with a revealing phrase: "This is my will for when my mission here among you has come to an end." Carlos knew his time was running out. By 2002, Colombia's political landscape was undergoing major changes. The peace process between President Andrés Pastrana's government and the FARC had collapsed, and the country was preparing to elect a new president. Álvaro Uribe Vélez emerged as the leading candidate, promoting a hardline stance against guerrilla groups that resonated with large sectors of the population. Within this context, Carlos Castaños began signaling his intention to negotiate his surrender to the justice system of the United States. A USB drive seized after his death contained thousands of emails in which he expressed frustration with the infiltration of trafficking networks of illegal substances inside the paramilitary movement. During a paramilitary summit, he stunned those present when he announced, "I have decided to surrender to the justice system of the United States. I have already made contact with agents from that country." This decision was not simply an act of remorse. Carlos believed the paramilitary project had been hijacked by traffickers of illegal substances who wanted to avoid extradition to the United States by infiltrating a future peace process. To him, this represented a betrayal of the founding principles of the self-defense movement. "I am not a trafficker," Carlos insisted in his final interviews. "The self-defense movement is not involved in trafficking. If any trafficker attempts to place himself at the center of this movement, he will have to answer for that conduct without compromising the United Self-Defense Forces of Colombia." This position increasingly isolated him within his own organization. While Carlos tried to distance the movement from trafficking networks, his brother Vicente had created a system of paramilitary franchises, allowing known traffickers to purchase their own operational blocks. Among these figures were Hernán Giraldo Serna, Francisco Javier Zuluaga, known as Gordo Lindo, Carlos Mario Jiménez, known as Macaco, and Juan Carlos Sierra, known as El Tuso Sierra. On July 12, 2002, Carlos formally resigned as political leader of the AUC. In an internal statement, he declared he would no longer share leadership with those who, in his words, had turned a political project into a trafficking enterprise. "The lack of command is evident," he said. "Everyone does whatever they want, not always with the best principles. And I do not believe an organization like that can bring peace of mind to Colombians." By 2003, during the first government of Álvaro Uribe Vélez, peace negotiations with the AUC began. The chosen location was Santa Fe de Ralito in Córdoba. The High Commissioner for Peace, Luis Carlos Restrepo, led the talks. The goal was to demobilize more than 30,000 armed men and gradually return territories. Carlos Castaños, still considered the moral and ideological leader of the movement, warned publicly that peace could not be discussed without first reaching an agreement with the United States, which already had extradition requests against several paramilitary leaders linked to trafficking networks. In his view, a serious process required legal guarantees, truth, and internal purification. This stance created deep tension inside the organization. Carlos did not believe traffickers without political commitment should be treated as commanders in a peace negotiation. He sent a statement that was read by Monsignor Julio Cesar Vidal Ortiz at the negotiation table, asking that no one directly linked to trafficking of illegal substances be allowed to participate in this process. At the same time, Carlos was facing a personal crisis. His daughter Rosa Maria had been diagnosed with Cri-du-Chat syndrome, a severe and incurable congenital disease. The family suffering affected him deeply. He spent much of his final years searching for treatments abroad, particularly in the United States. This situation pushed him further away from military operations and deepened his disappointment with the direction the organization was taking. According to testimonies, Carlos began consuming illegal substances and large amounts of alcohol to cope with stress and anxiety. He suffered episodes of depression and unpredictable bursts of rage. Ivan Roberto Duque, known as Ernesto Baez, who served as his political advisor, later recalled that Carlos barely slept during his final years. Suddenly, he would explode in anger and threaten to take someone out with the automatic pistol he always carried on his belt, Baez said. Baez himself experienced one of those outbursts when Carlos accused him of being friends with traffickers. Carlos pulled out his gun and pointed it at my head for several seconds from less than a meter away, Baez recalled. His hand was trembling as he stared at me with wild eyes. The only thing I could think to do was close my eyes and wait for the shot. Suddenly, he flipped the gun around, grabbed it by the barrel, and struck me hard in the forehead. The paramilitary high command, including figures like Diego Fernando Murillo, known as Don Berna, and Ernesto Baez, concluded that Carlos's stance represented a threat to the negotiation process with the government. The decision was direct. He had to be eliminated before he could hand over sensitive information to authorities in the United States. On Friday, April 16, 2004, Carlos arrived at 5 p.m. at the Rancho Alhambra store. He was dressed in civilian clothes and accompanied by bodyguards in a green double-cab Hilux truck. He carried a laptop connected to an external drive but chose to use the two computers inside the store. Doña Hilva Rosa Morales Fareles, the owner of the establishment, remembers that just after Carlos sat down, the first bursts of gunfire erupted. I looked through the door that faced the main road and saw several men firing toward my store, she later said. I threw myself on the ground, and from there I saw Carlos jump through the back window and run. A paramilitary commander imprisoned in the high-security prison of Itagüí later revealed that Vicente Castaño had been Machiavellian in planning the operation. He made sure that among the men chosen to eliminate him were those who hated him the most. One of those men, known as Mobile 5, delivered the final shot to Carlos's head. Mobile 5 had often been the target of Carlos's insults. According to witnesses, Carlos once mocked him in front of the entire unit, calling him homosexual and claiming he had AIDS. Monolech and Mobile 5, who led the operation, chased Carlos into a grain storage area near the store. One of the bullets had already hit him before he jumped from the window, and he had not yet fully recovered from a broken arm. Monolech fired again and subdued him, dragging him to an open area. "Who gave the order to eliminate me?" Carlos asked. "The professor, your brother Vicente. You turned against the organization," Monolech replied before handing him over to Mobile 5. "Brother, please don't take my life. Little brother, I already sent word and I'll explain everything to him. This is a misunderstanding. Please, I beg you, don't take my life. Think about my daughter. Tell the professor to think about my mother, Carlos pleaded. Once Carlos was dead, Monalesh informed Vicente through a radio. It's done, boss. The park is clean. Monalesh himself transported the body in the back of one of the trucks. They covered it with banana and palm leaves. All of Carlos's bodyguards were eliminated. 2 of them were never found. Carlos's body was buried in a clandestine grave. More than 2 years would pass before his remains were located, thanks to the confession of one of the men involved in a DNA test using blood from Carlos Esteban Duque, the unrecognized son mentioned in his will. But the story of the Castaño brothers did not end with Carlos's death. Vicente, the last surviving brother, continued operating from the shadows while negotiations in Santa Fe de Ralito moved forward. However, when President Uribe ordered several paramilitary leaders transferred to the high-security prison in Itagüí, Vicente abandoned the process and declared himself in open dissent. This decision alarmed the paramilitary high command. They feared Vicente might build a new parallel power capable of reorganizing the armed structure. So the former leaders of the organization, calculating the risks of his independent leadership, decided to eliminate him as well. In August 2006, Vicente Castaño disappeared without a trace. According to testimony gathered by investigators, an armed group stormed the farm where he was hiding. Vicente managed to fire a few shots before locking himself inside a bathroom. Realizing his death was imminent, he shot himself in the forehead. His body was placed inside the drum of a cement mixer. Once hardened into a block, it was thrown into a river. The last of the Castaño brothers had met the same fate as the others. The tragedy of this family reveals a disturbing truth about the Colombian conflict. What began as a supposed defense against insurgent groups eventually degenerated into a network of interests where ideology was replaced by business. The brothers who swore to avenge their father ended up eliminating each other, victims of their own contradictions and ambitions. Doña Rosa Eva Gil, the matriarch who gave birth to the 3 men who would alter the course of Colombian history, died without ever learning the full truth about the fate of her sons. Her final request to Vicente, that he build a giant concrete cross so tall it could be seen from anywhere in Antioquia, with a sign reading, "Here lies a hero," was never fulfilled. The story of the Castaños is ultimately a parable about how power corrupts and violence consumes even those who wield it. 3 brothers who built an empire through fear ended up becoming victims of their own creation. Like in the ancient Greek tragedies, the Castaños could not escape their destiny. Those who live by the sword die by the sword. And in their case, the sword was held by the hand of their own blood.